Welcome to the first characteristic of a good tax, sufficiency. As any good politician would tell you, taxes need to be sufficient to keep the government operating. If a government is unable to support itself, its collapse is imminent. Since governments are self-perpetuating, this generally only happens when things are going terribly wrong for the government. For example, a coup. Recall that revenues are really for the most part taxes, and taxes are rate times base. Also note that governments are nonprofit entities. If a government collects too much revenue, it should return that revenue to the taxpayers. If a government has too little revenue, then it has a few options. One option is to use accounting trickery, and I assure you the governments are not shy about trying such maneuvers. California employees like myself are paid once a month, typically on the last day of the month. One year, to accomplish a bit of budget trickery, the final paycheck of the state's fiscal year was moved to the first day of the following year. Anyone who paid attention during your fundamental financial accounting course should know that is an entirely bogus move, since the services were provided and the liability incurred, but from a budget perspective it worked, because the accounting system does not work under normal GAAP rules. However, tricks like that only work in the short run and for smaller amounts. Instead, what governments often do when revenues are less than spending is borrow. And the U.S. government is no stranger to this activity. Economists generally measure a country's debt by comparing it to the country's gross domestic product. This is not dissimilar to the way a bank examines an individual's income before loaning money for a car or a house. This chart shows U.S. borrowing from about 1970 on. You should note that borrowing was also very high during World War II. You can see that since about 1980, we have been on a bit of a bender with the financial crisis of the late 2000s, putting us into much higher than normal amounts of debt. My personal opinion is that we're a bit like someone that has maxed out their credit cards and then lost their job and then really had to borrow. How much debt is too much? That is a difficult question to answer. The Economist magazine keeps track of country-by-country debt, and I presented a 2015 snapshot for you with details from our two neighbors, Canada and Mexico, on the right-hand side of the slide. You can see we have a great deal more debt per capita than Mexico, but not a lot more than Canada. Does that mean Mexico is on track and we're way too high? Not necessarily. If we agree that interest rates are a reflection of the time value of money and the risk of non-payment, then the U.S. seems to be enjoying some of the lowest debt costs ever. It would appear that even at these amounts, the world seems to think the full faith and credit of the U.S. is still a pretty darn good bet. Well, how does the debt discussion relate to taxes, you ask? Well, government borrowing is simply borrowing against future tax revenue. Government debt is more like a credit card than a house. There's no property to foreclose on if the government fails to pay. Instead, the creditors are banking on the government's ability to raise the necessary revenue to pay them back plus interest. As a result, countries with greater earning potential tend to be better able to borrow. If we go back a slide, you can see that the economies of sub-Saharan Africa are not able to support much borrowing. That is also like real life. When you really need the money, it seems that is when it's most difficult to come by anyone that will loan it to you. One of the problems with the U.S. government's continued spending habits is that you, as mostly younger folks, I'm assuming, need to recognize that we are writing checks that you will be asked to cover through your taxes. Eventually, we'll have to cover that debt, and when we do, I just want to say in advance, thank you. What better way to close this video than a heartfelt thanks for paying my salary, healthcare, and retirement through your current and future taxes. Did I already say thank you? I won't even raise the specter of the possible externalities such as climate change that my generation seems happy to leave to yours. This is the end of video T2B on sufficiency. Our next video continues the discussion of sufficiency by looking at tax dynamics. Thanks for watching.